Volendam was awaiting us at the Sydney International Shipping Terminal. We depart from Sydney at dusk on a beautiful autumn evening. Once out to sea, the pilot leaves us and we're on our way. Next stop, Noumea, in 3 days' time. We had a really nice cabin to relax in and a big TV for movies if we wanted them, but sadly the TV quickly gave us the bad news, and it sure was rough at times, with seas up to 6 meters. After Noumea, we sail on to Vanuatu, to 2 of the Fijian islands, and then on to Samoa, and then 3 long days at sea to Honolulu. We spent a delightful day at each of the 4 Hawaiian islands. You'll see that on a separate video. And then we had 5 nights and days at sea before reaching the Canadian coast at Vancouver on a beautiful day, after a full month traversing the wide Pacific on Volendam, and looking forward to placid waters in Alaska's famous Inside Passage, heading north this afternoon. Well, here we go. It was quite a cool evening with lots of snow still on the mountains in behind Vancouver. We cruised past stockpiles of elemental sulphur and a fertilizer plant on Vancouver's North Shore. Then under Vancouver's copy of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge, which connects the city to the north side. As evening falls, we head north with a string of snow-covered peaks to our right as we head towards Alaska. Beautiful dawn next morning, and Volendam then spent the whole day heading further north at a steady 20 knots or 37 kilometres an hour. For hour after hour we cruised past the most magnificent snow-capped peaks, and on one occasion we passed another large cruise ship heading south. A skilled pilot who has guided our way through the Inside Passage so far heads ashore, as we now move into more open sea. This pretty lighthouse was typical of many which would guide us north overnight. It was another magnificent dawn, and on this, our 3rd day north from Vancouver, we were destined to have some magnificent scenery in an amazing waterway called Tracy Arm. And as we cruised along the coastline, the rugged mountains on the skyline foretold the magnificent scenery we had ahead of us that day. With a little help from Google Earth, let's grab some satellite images so that we can work out just where we are. I've superimposed a red line on the map to show our route from Vancouver to Juneau, and an arrow shows just where we are right now. As we start to close in on this rugged coast, we start to see the huge forests of fir trees cladding the slopes. And we come across our first trawler fishing the prolific Alaskan waterways. What magnificent mountains! And this is a classic volcanic plug peak. The perfect cone. And lots more. We now turn tightly to starboard to enter the narrowest portion of the Tracy Arm. Further up the arm, we will hope to see icebergs be carved and floating on the surface from the many small glaciers in this area. And there it is. This is our first small iceberg. The blue colouring in the iceberg is a measure of its purity. The bluer the better. This mountainside tells a dramatic story of the eons of violent tectonic movements and glacial action, which has shaped this cliff face into the wonderful, amazing rugged form it shows today. Just look at that huge fault line gap in the cliff face. And the striation marks caused by the retreating glacier on the cliff face. This cliff face has an astonishing story to tell in geological terms, probably covering millions of years of upheaval and rising and falling water levels and glacial action. Just look at those glacier polished faces shining in the sunlight. It's amazing that foliage has managed to grow on these barren vertical slopes. As we head further into the narrows of Tracy Arm, we see more and more icebergs. None of them are the thick icebergs one associates with those that have broken off the ice shelf in the Arctic or the Antarctic, because these are small icebergs which represent the moving glaciers coming down and reaching the open sea and breaking off at that point. But of course they are then much thinner than they would be were they an ice shelf floating in the open sea. At the left of the screen, that small glacier flowing down that valley was probably the source of these icebergs we're now seeing floating in the bay. Here's another ice floe coming down the side of the valley and spawning these floating icebergs we see. We're now at the head of Tracy Arm and must turn around soon and head back to sea. But first we'll cruise around for a little while amongst these wonderful icebergs and marvel at the fact that we can bring a ship as big as this right up this tiny arm. Volendam is 60,000 tons, and although it's not the biggest of ships, it's amazing that there's enough water here for this large ship to come in here and of course turn around and get out again. It's quite fascinating to see the myriad shapes of these icebergs as they start to melt. It has been a wonderful experience cruising through Tracy Arm and seeing all these icebergs and the glaciers on the steep hillsides which had caused them to fall. 90% of the iceberg is of course underwater, and it was fascinating to see how little effect the ship's wake had on the iceberg as it met the iceberg. In fact, I thought the skipper of Volendam did remarkably well, not coming into contact with any of the icebergs of any size. Back past this rugged cliffside, but the day was drawing to a close and we had to leave. And the plan was that the ship would dawdle outside in the more open channels overnight and then head towards Juneau next morning. And our cabin TV told us just what the plan was. We now sailed thousands and thousands of miles across the wide Pacific, all the way from Sydney, and we're a long way north from Vancouver, but it seems we're only 51 nautical miles south from Juneau. And we're about to head north up the Stevens Passage to get there. Now let's have a look at a more detailed map and trace our route with this white line from Tracy Arm right into the town of Juneau itself. Very pleasant cruise up the channel, and as the city came into view, nestled below snow-capped Mount Juneau, we passed by a floating salmon farm, a major industry here, and its onshore processing facility. Nearing town, it was quickly clear that we weren't the only ships in port. Radius of the Seas was already sending its passengers to the top of 4,000 foot high Mount Roberts for great view. Being the last ship to arrive, Volendam had to manoeuvre itself very carefully into a very tight berth in behind the Radiance of the Seas, but it was by far the best berth, right in the middle of town. Although capital of Alaska, a very large state, Juneau is quite a small city, quite compact, and accessible only by sea and air. There is no road access at all. So the arrival of so many people aboard large passenger vessels like this was pretty important to the local economy. And as Volendam's passengers disembarked to enjoy things to see in Juneau, stalls were set up waiting for them, and it was going to be quite a busy day in town for the locals. Juneau began in 1880 with the discovery of gold. It then grew rapidly during the Klondike Gold Rush 17 years later. I guess the arrival of all these cruise ships is ensuring that gold keeps coming into town. The famous Red Dog Saloon should certainly get some of it, but frankly our interest was more in the famous Juneau icefield behind those mountains. Marjorie was able to make a flight to the Mendenhall Glacier too, using the remarkable disabled person boarding device made by the helicopter crew. It was brilliant, and although she couldn't get off at the icefield, she was thrilled to be part of it all. She is carefully tucked on board, and here we go. Juneau straddles the Gatineau Channel, with the city centre being sighted on the eastern shore. From the heliport, we head south down the channel towards the city centre. Our flight path takes us along the western side of the channel, until well south of the city. In passing by, we got another good shot of the city and Volendam awaiting our return. We tracked past the most magnificent snow-capped mountains and then had a very pleasant flight further south down the Gatineau Channel. We had 3 helicopters travelling in convoy, the reason being that if one went down, the other was available to radio in for rescue help or give direct help itself. We often saw occasional abandoned gold mine on the shoreline, showing just how large a part the discovery and mining of gold had played in the development of this part of Alaska. And we then crossed the channel and head east into the mountains, with the Gatineau Channel now on our right and looping away towards the east. We now head deeper into the mountains to get access to the Mendenhall Glacier and its huge ice field. In the valley, this little stream showed the snowmelt as winter turned towards spring and summer. We met up again with the Gatineau Channel on our right as it looped further towards the east. We traversed over truly magnificent snow-capped mountains. And suddenly there was the huge mass of packed ice of the Mendenhall Glacier ahead of us. We quickly dropped down and flew along the actual face of the glacier, where it was slowly tumbling away and falling into an arm of the Gatineau Channel. We then flew along it for some time to look at the amazing sight of the debris the melting ice was depositing to gradually silt up the waterway. In places, forests of quite advanced fir trees were growing in the silt, and more debris from the advancing glacier continued to block up the Gatineau Channel. At least this dead-end arm of the channel was being turned into new land. We are now flying slow and low along the 3-mile width of the glacier, at this point where it meets the sea, and where it is some 500 feet thick. The thicker ice we are now approaching has shapes which are quite bizarre, quite amazing. The dirty colour of the ice in the picture is of course ancient rock and tree debris contained within the ice. With the start of the Mendenhall Glacier now some 100 miles back into the mountains, the debris dumped into the channel could be thousands of years old. The thicker ice we are now approaching has shapes which are quite bizarre, quite amazing, with the ice being stacked up and twisted as the glacier swings away towards the south. The blue colouring in the ice represents purer and probably newer ice from fresh snow cover which is frozen. Now it is time to swing back up the glacier and find a safe spot to land. But first, a final look at the silted channel before we head inland. And a closer look at the amazing shapes of the stacked up ice at the face of the glacier. This clearly showed just how much ancient debris is carried within the ice as it breaks away at the face of the glacier. And here we are. The two lead helicopters have landed and we look around for a suitable place to put ours down. Not easy because much of the ice field is badly broken at this point. We need to find a spot to land on firm ice and not soft snow, which could be unsafe for the chopper and also for us to walk on, although we have spiked boots for the ice. Now, cut the motor and the turbine winds down. It had been a great flight all the way from Juneau to the glacier, but the passengers were keen to get out of the rather cramped cabin, but unfortunately poor Marjorie couldn't step down, although I was able to do so. One of the passengers was good enough to take a couple of stills and give shaky video shots for me.
There we go, perfect.
It was bitterly cold, but it was still a great opportunity to open the cabin door briefly so that Marjorie could have a good look. It was almost too cold to hold and operate the camera, yet it was worth every moment of it. And there was a little pond of just melted ice. Behind our chopper was a hillside of substantial fir trees and a waterfall from the melty snow above. And a delightful panorama across the glacier, all the way down to the Gatineau Channel below. But suddenly it's all aboard and we're on our way. We're the second chopper off and we swing away towards the silted up arm of the Gatineau Channel. And there were lots of real surprises ahead. First, we were surprised by the forests of quite advanced fir trees, growing in extensive areas of new land formed by sediments from the glacier. These were quite big trees with many years of growth behind them. And now we had at least to travel in a new direction, in a big loop around to get back to Juneau. We were quite astonished by the millions and millions of tons of debris to completely silt this dead-end arm of the Gatineau Channel. These sediments were immense in area, and then as the camera swings to the left, we have a real surprise. The second arm of the Mendenhall Glacier, which we didn't know about, discharging masses of material into further extensions of this dead arm of the Gatineau Channel. This arm of the glacier was even thicker than the one before, many hundreds of feet, probably thousands. The thickness and extent of this second arm of the Mendenhall Glacier became ever more evident as we headed inland for mile after mile over the glacier, towards the high mountain beyond, which of course we had to cross to get back to Juneau. With a Pathfinder chopper leading the way, our pilot seemed to be pretty confident about where we were going. Travelling this inland route back to Juneau allowed us to see much more of this vast Mendenhall Glacier and more of the huge Juneau icefield, which apparently covers hundreds of square miles. We had been remarkably fortunate to have such beautifully fine sunny weather, because the helicopters hadn't been able to fly for the past week when it had been raining. We travelled for mile after mile over these starkly beautiful snow-capped mountains. It was absolutely wonderful. It was just a little bit bumpy at times, making steady photography just a little bit difficult, but it was pure magic. Finally, we come over the mountains, and there below us lies the Juneau Channel again. There's a dam in the mountains supplying water to Juneau, and then we drop down further and come back along the Juneau Channel to make a big loop to have our landing back at the helipad. With 3 helicopters heading for the same landing pad, our pilot had to be a bit cautious and looked around very carefully. After such a superb trip, we're almost sad to be landing. It had been wonderful to see the famous Mendenhall Glacier and the huge extent of the Juneau icefield. Back in Juneau, the town was shutting down for the night, and Volendam was making ready to head further north to Skagway overnight. And its farewell to Alaska's capital, snuggled below extinct volcano Mount Juneau above. The last few stragglers come aboard, and away we go. It is 103 nautical miles north from Juneau to Skagway, and by the time we got there, the weather certainly had changed. We were moored behind right into the sea, and it was miserably cold, wet and windy. And the other cruise ships headed out of town as quickly as they could. And I suspect that our skipper on the bridge had similar thoughts. These were my only shots of Skagway, taken from Volendam during a brief break in the appalling weather. And 100 miles southwest overnight took us to magnificent, amazing Glacier Bay. At dawn, the weather was clear, and we had the most beautiful day to follow in this astonishing waterway. A pilot and a guide from the Glacier Bay National Park Reserve comes aboard to guide us on our way and to tell us a bit about this amazing bay. There were small glaciers everywhere, which gave us some inkling of what amazing experiences and sights were yet to come. This is the debris at the end of the Carroll Glacier, which heads off around and behind that mountain to the left. Even in this remote part of the world, there's a jet stream in the blue sky above us. The bridge tells us that there's a jet en route from Vladivostok to New York. The mountain scenery was quite breathtaking. And we're now cruising amongst some small icebergs broken off from some of those glaciers. The mountain scenery was quite breathtaking. These are the Grand Pacific and Meldrum glaciers, where they discharge into the sea. And from now on, the incredible mountain scenery gets even more spectacular. These presently denuded fir trees are apparently quite unique because periodically they die off and then have renewed growth. It's quite amazing that a 62,000 ton cruise vessel can get so close to this awesome scenery. How about these amazing reflection shots we're getting now? And it goes on for mile after mile. And it just gets better and better and better. I apologise for giving you so much amazing scenery to watch, but I simply couldn't shut down the camera when these amazing views were floating in front of it. And although we didn't know it at the time, these tiny birds skimming the water were telling us that a really magnificent experience lay right ahead of us, because they lived in the rock face just below the rim of the incredible Marjorie Glacier coming up now. This was to be by far the highlight of our visit to Glacier Bay, as you will see. Our skipper carefully manoeuvred Volendam into the perfect viewing position for our passengers. And the word went around that the blue ice showing on the face of the glacier was almost ideal for carving on iceberg, which hopefully we would see. The excited passengers quickly gathered on the top deck in great anticipation. In astonishing silence, the passengers listened for the creaking of the ice as it bumped and thumped, breaking away, getting ready to fall. They scanned the face of the glacier really carefully, looking for the right spot. Now just listen to that ice thumping away as we scanned the face of the glacier, looking for the next spot to fall. The wave pushes some of the little icebergs our way, but there's more to come, lots more. Now, where will the next one be? It's not making a lot of noise, but it's blue and it certainly looks pretty precarious. Sorry it's a bit shaky. The camera was handheld and it was on full telly, and the ship was moving slowly too, so all up it was pretty hard to get a steady shot. It sure is, and the ship is too, because it's time to go. We now have a long overnight trip way to the south to Ketchikan, as shown by the white line on the map. Other large cruise ships are also enjoying the delights of this magnificent inside passage. A lone sailor too, as evening falls. It was early morning in Ketchikan and everyone seemed to have a float plane. It was the equivalent of the family car here. Some people left town on the early commercial jet heading south, but others flocked into town in float planes arriving one after another for a visit to the important provincial centre of Ketchikan. Many arrived on the inter-island ferry, but still the float planes kept coming. And once again we had other cruise ships for company at our berth. And Ketchikan was wide awake to make the most of this commercial opportunity. Ketchikan is clearly a very important commercial centre for the widely spread people in this very sparse part of Alaska. Like much of the world today, tourism is obviously vital. Lots of shops and restaurants along the waterfront, of course. Ketchikan was quite a compact town, rather delightful place really, and of course it called itself the salmon capital of the world, with good reason of course. And there are the usual tourist gimmicks, but I guess this is a pretty good way to see town, and the waterway is nearby. Ketchikan is very much the tourist trap of course, and shows a strong Russian influence, because this area was originally Russian before it was sold off to the United States. There was lots of jewellery featuring exclusively Russian gemstones, and of course many of the better known things which come from Russia. This jewellery features very exclusive Russian gemstone called charoite, spelt C-H-A-R-O-I-T-E. This gemstone is found in only one place in the world, Sakar in Siberia. Charoite was first discovered in the 1940s, but was not known to the outside world until about 1978, when it first became known as a very desirable gemstone for jewellery. It seemed like a good idea for Marjorie to bring some charoite back as a memento of her visit to Russian Ketchikan. But it was now time to leave. And our cabin TV screen told us that we still had a long way to go to get back to Vancouver. The series of maps on screen showed our route back all the way to Vancouver. It was quite a long way. We were heading south, of course, and the barometer was falling. That means bad weather ahead. Certainly all the locals were heading out of town as fast as they could. It makes our local cab rack look pretty sleepy, doesn't it? Ketchikan logged up to 300 flights every day, which has to be a record for any town of its size. But of course there are no road in or out, it's air or sea or nothing. And it's time for us to take off too. With the tourists all gone, Ketchikan very quickly was a sleepy hollow once again. The large number of boats in the crowded marina shows just how important water transport is to Ketchikan. Export of wild Alaskan salmon is Ketchikan's main industry, and the US Coast Guard is a major employer in town too. And we're now headed for distant Vancouver. But first we must cruise past the magnificent Queen Charlotte Islands, where heavy rain made our deck chairs on our veranda quite unusable, but showed why the fertile Queen Charlotte Islands were a magnificent repository of quick-growing fir trees. It sure was wet. But that rich volcanic soil and those rapidly growing fir trees must have loved it. Even the tiny little islets had thriving fir trees growing on them. The marks on the shoreline shows the extreme range between high and low tide in this part of the world. Fortunately, our skipper's resolve didn't flag, and he kept Volendam moving steadily ahead towards Vancouver, no matter how dark it might be and how narrow the channel might become. The waterways between these islands were quite narrow, and there were navigation beacons and lights everywhere. This part of the trip would be quite magnificent, full sunshine, but the rain and the mist had this special magic too. The storm clouds were becoming quite dark and heavy now, and we were beginning to wonder just how bad the weather may become further ahead. There seemed to be small islands absolutely everywhere, and I think the skipper did quite a remarkable job navigating his way around these little bits of islands and through the narrow straits. Quite a tricky course to follow. The rain became much heavier, and even the seabirds were looking for shelter. Suddenly the clouds seemed to roll back, and quickly the weather became quite nice. And now we saw the managed plantations, where they were logging good fir timber and replanting for new growth, and the growth was very quick, so that they could quite safely take quite large stacks of timber out, without risk of leaving the hillside denuded for too long. This is superb new growth timber growing very rapidly. This area of Canada has become the world's largest exporter of plantation-grown softwood. Night quickly came, and our cabin TV told us where we are and what lay ahead. The map shows our track east of Vancouver Island and right through to Vancouver itself. As you can see, it's quite a tricky run through the Strait of Georgia, into Vancouver Harbour and the city. But as dawn broke, we were there. We passed under Vancouver's copy of the Golden Gate Bridge of San Francisco, head towards our berth at Canada Place. We then, from Sydney across the wide Pacific to Vancouver, then to Alaska and back to Vancouver, Volendam had logged just a little over 17,000 kilometres, over 5 wonderful weeks. And it's journey's end for Volendam, but not for us yet. We will have 5 superb days in brilliant Vancouver, but that will be in another video. So, au revoir for now, but we do hope you enjoyed your visit with us to wonderful Alaska.